The hospital corridor was too quiet for a place where lives were constantly being saved or lost. Detective Armin Haleem noticed that first. Silence always arrived before truth did. It was just before dawn when he stepped off the elevator, the fluorescent lights flickering above him like tired eyes refusing to close. Nurses spoke in whispers, shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor. To anyone else, it looked like another emergency wing finishing a long night. To Armin, it felt staged, like a room holding its breath. He had built his career on moments like this. Not dramatic confessions or high-speed chases, but the pauses, the gaps between words, the things people avoided saying. A young nurse stood near the door at the end of the hall, hands folded too tightly in front of her. When she saw Armin's badge, she hesitated for half a second before nodding him through. Half a second was enough. Inside, machines hummed steadily. A woman lay unconscious on the bed, her face pale, lips slightly parted as if she had been interrupted mid-sentence. Tubes and wires framed her body like restraints. Her name was on the chart, but Armin didn't read it yet. Names came later. Stories came first. He looked instead at her hands. Fingernails chipped. A faint tremor still lingering in her fingers, even in sedation. She had fought to stay awake, fought to stay alive. Behind him, a man stood near the window. The husband. He was clean, too clean. Clothes pressed, hair neatly combed. No visible signs of panic or exhaustion. He stared out at the city as if watching traffic, instead of waiting beside his wife's hospital bed. When Armin cleared his throat, the man turned slowly, offering a polite, controlled smile. "Detective," he said, as if this were a scheduled meeting. Armin nodded. He didn't sit. He rarely did in rooms like this. Sitting suggested comfort. This was not a place for comfort. "Long night," Armin said casually. The husband exhaled, a practiced sigh. You could say that. Armin let the silence stretch. Most people rushed to fill it. The husband didn't. Another note taken, mentally, always mentally. Outside the room, a doctor spoke quietly with a colleague. Armin had already heard the words before entering. Rupture, delay, critical window. Medical language that danced carefully around blame. He glanced once more at the woman on the bed. 6 weeks post-surgery, according to the chart. A procedure meant to change her life. Instead, it had nearly ended it. "Your wife's condition," Armin began, watching the man's face rather than listening to his response, "was very serious when she arrived." "Yes," the husband said. "So they told me. Not when I brought her in. Not when I called for help. Just when she arrived." Armin felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The quiet signal that told him this case would stay with him. Some crimes announced themselves loudly. Others whispered, hoping no one would lean close enough to hear. He took a final look around the room. The untouched chair beside the bed. The phone on the side table, fully charged. No flowers. No personal belongings. Nothing that suggested someone had been waiting here long. As he turned to leave, Armin spoke softly, almost to himself. "People think silence means nothing happened," he said. Usually it meant the opposite. The husband didn't respond. In the hallway, the nurse from earlier avoided his eyes. Armin didn't press her, not yet. Time had a way of loosening tongues. For now, he walked toward the exit, already reconstructing the night in his mind. Somewhere, 6 weeks earlier, a decision had been made, and someone had paid for it in blood. Behind him, the machines continued their steady hum, keeping a woman alive while the truth waited patiently to be heard. 6 weeks earlier, the mirrors still felt like strangers. She stood in front of the bedroom dresser, moving slowly, carefully, as if her body belonged to someone else now. Every step reminded her of the surgeon's warnings, the tight compression garment biting into her skin, the dull ache that never fully disappeared. Pain, she had been told, was temporary. Beauty was a reward. Her husband had chosen the clinic. "You'll feel more confident," he'd said, scrolling through photos on his phone, bodies shaped into perfection by angles and filters. "It's an investment. For us." For us. The words echoed now as she adjusted the garment, wincing when the fabric rubbed against a tender spot. Purple bruises bloomed along her hips and lower back, hidden beneath clothes, hidden beneath smiles. He didn't like when she mentioned them. The recovery weeks blurred together in quiet routines, medication alarms, short walks around the living room, pillow stacked just right so she could sleep without pain. He hovered at first, bringing meals, reminding her to take photos to track progress. Friends called, but visits were postponed. She needs rest, he told them. Doctor's orders. Slowly, the world shrank to the size of their home. She remembered the first time she tried to complain. Not dramatically, just a soft confession whispered late at night. "I still hurt," she said. "More than they said I would." He didn't look at her. "Healing isn't pretty," he replied. "You knew that going in." She nodded, because disagreeing felt ungrateful, because he had paid, because she wanted to believe him. Each week, he asked the same question, framed like concern but edged with expectation. "Do you see the difference yet? Don't you feel better? Wasn't it worth it?" She learned how to answer correctly. By the 4th week, the bruises faded to yellow. By the 5th, she was allowed to stop wearing the garment for short periods. He noticed everything, how her clothes fit, how strangers looked, how she walked more carefully than before. "You're almost ready," he said one evening, his hand resting possessively on her waist. She stiffened, though she tried not to show it. "Doctor said 6 weeks," she reminded him gently. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Doctors exaggerate. That night, alone in the bathroom, she examined herself again. The swelling was still there, the scars angry and pink. She touched them lightly, wondering when her body would start feeling like home again. Somewhere deep inside, unease stirred, small, persistent, easy to ignore. She didn't ignore it because she couldn't afford to. This surgery had been a promise that things would improve, that arguments would soften, that the distance she felt between them would close. Admitting doubt felt like admitting failure. So she pushed herself, walked longer, sat straighter, smiled wider. When pain flared, she swallowed it down with medication and reassurance. "It's just part of the process," she told herself. By the 6th week, he stopped asking how she felt. Instead, he asked when she would be ready. The night before her follow-up appointment, she lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling as his breathing slowed into sleep. Her body throbbed quietly, a warning she didn't yet have words for. 6 weeks had passed. The bruises were fading. The beauty was almost visible, and the pressure, unspoken but heavy, was about to become impossible to ignore. By the 6th week, the lines between care and control had blurred so thoroughly that she barely recognized the difference anymore. Her body, still tender from surgery, had become a silent battleground. Every movement, every glance, was weighed against his expectations. What was meant to be a celebration of new curves and confidence had turned into a test she couldn't win. He watched her in ways that went unnoticed by anyone else. A tilt of her head, a slight hesitation in her walk, the way she avoided mirrors in the morning light. Nothing escaped him. At first, she thought it was affection. Now, she wondered if it was surveillance. "You need to hold yourself differently," he said one evening, as she reached for a glass of water. His voice was calm, but it carried the subtle weight of command. "Sit straighter. Walk taller." She obeyed, even as pain flared along her lower back. She wanted harmony, but the harmony came at the cost of her comfort. It was never just about posture. It was about control. Control masked as care, guidance disguised as love. In the bathroom mirror, she studied the reflection he had trained her to notice. A tight abdomen, a curved waist, a silhouette that would draw the right attention. She thought of the bruises still faintly yellow on her skin, the tender spots that flared whenever pressure was applied. And yet, when she tried to mention discomfort, he deflected. "Pain is temporary," he reminded her. "Confidence lasts forever." The living room became a stage. Every evening after work, he lingered nearby while she moved through her routine. He complimented selectively, praised obedience more than recovery, measuring her worth through her compliance. Friends and family notices were rare. He discouraged questions, small interjections that could remind her there was a life outside the walls of their apartment. One Friday evening, after a long day of subtle corrections, how she laughed, how she crossed her legs, how she smiled. He finally spoke in a way that made her flinch. "Soon we'll be ready," he said, voice low, almost conspiratorial. "It's time to celebrate what you become." She nodded, unsure if he meant the surgery or her submission. Her body ached in places she hadn't admitted existed. Bruises, swelling, tenderness, reminders of her fragility. Yet he smiled, satisfied with her compliance, as though her quiet endurance were a gift. She wanted to tell him she wasn't ready, that 6 weeks weren't enough. But the words never formed. Instead, she learned to preempt the conversation, answering with what he wanted to hear. "I'm ready," she whispered one night, lying in bed beside him. Her chest tightened as she said it. Perhaps it was the truth. Perhaps it was a survival instinct kicking in. He reached for her hand, gentle yet possessive. "Good," he murmured. "Tomorrow will be perfect." Sleep was restless. Every creak of the apartment, every distant car alarm outside, made her heart race. She felt the invisible countdown pressing down on her ribs. The sense at this moment, this initiation into a new, perfected version of herself, was inevitable. She remembered the surgeon's warning during the final checkup. Give your body time. Recovery is key. 6 weeks isn't always enough. But those words had faded under the weight of his insistence, buried beneath the pressure of marriage that demanded performance, not patience. As she closed her eyes that night, she felt a lingering fear, a whisper at the edge of her mind she couldn't shake. Something about the anticipation felt dangerous, not in the way of accidents, but in the way of choices made in quiet corners of power and expectation. Choices that were not hers to make. Morning would come soon, and with it, the first test of her body, her will, and their marriage. A test neither of them could prepare for entirely, and one that would ripple through every remaining week of her recovery. The quiet tension in the bedroom pressed down like a weight. The lines between love and control, beauty and obedience were almost invisible, but they were there, and they would define what came next. Tomorrow, she would find out just how much pressure a marriage could endure before it broke entirely. The night had started like any other. Soft music played from the corner speaker, dim lights casting long shadows across the bedroom walls. She tried to focus on calm, on breathing slowly, on pretending the day hadn't been filled with subtle instructions and controlled gestures. But her body remembered every bruise, every ache, every whispered correction he had given her over the past 6 weeks. He stood behind her for a moment, hands brushing lightly over her shoulders, a touch that was meant to soothe, but felt like a measuring stick instead. She closed her eyes, hoping it was just affection, just tenderness, just the intimacy they were meant to share. The tension in her muscles was almost unbearable, each movement reminding her of the fragility beneath her skin. "Relax," he whispered, the word soft but firm, commanding. "Tonight will be perfect." She nodded, though the word perfect carried a weight that pressed down on her chest. She wanted to trust him, to let herself feel pleasure instead of fear, but the memory of pain lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Minutes passed slowly, each one dragging the tension tighter. She felt her heart race, not with excitement, but with apprehension. And then the first sharp pain hit, like a rope tightening around her waist. She gasped, clutching his arm instinctively. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm, controlled. I think something's wrong," she stammered, panic rising in her throat. The pain was sudden, intense, and unfamiliar. It radiated through her lower back and hips, spreading in a wave that left her trembling. She tried to sit up, tried to stand, but the pain anchored her to the bed. He didn't move immediately. He just watched, calculating, his eyes flicking over her body like he was reading a chart no one else could see. "Sure, just breathe," he said softly. But there was a strange distance in his tone, a detachment that made her chest tighten even further. She felt alone, though he was right there. A sudden, sharp tear of pain forced a scream past her lips. Her body shuddered, and she collapsed back onto the bed. The sound of her voice, raw and desperate, filled the room. But he didn't call anyone. He only knelt beside her, hands hovering over her, unsure or unwilling to act. The minutes stretched endlessly. Her breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts. Blood pooled in ways she had been told to watch for after surgery. Each second without help twisted the panic deeper, turning fear into an unbearable physical ache. She looked at him, eyes wide and pleading. "Please call someone," she managed between ragged breaths. He shook his head. A faint, almost imperceptible line formed between his brows. "It'll be fine," he said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. But the reassurance felt hollow. Like a shadow of the urgency she could feel in every nerve. Her mind spun in terror. Was this accident or something worse? Why wasn't he calling for help? Every warning from the doctor, every instinct she had, screamed at her that time was slipping through their fingers like sand. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic from her post-op care, mixed with a metallic tang of blood. The lights, once comforting, now seemed harsh, exposing every bruise, every swelling curve of her fragile body. She tried to move, to reach the phone on the nightstand, but the pain forced her back against the sheets. In the corner, his gaze never left her face. Calm, calculating, detached, and then a new fear settled in her chest. This was not just pain. This was the unthinkable realization that the person she trusted most, the one who promised to protect her, might be watching her suffer instead. Her cries echoed in the room, unanswered, while outside the window, the city continued its oblivious rhythm. In that moment, she understood that nothing would ever be the same. The night stretched on, marking the end of innocence, the beginning of suspicion, and the moment when a single choice would ripple through every week that followed. By morning, her body would be forever changed, and the truth of what happened tonight would begin to take shape, though she could not yet see it. Morning light crept through the blinds, thin strips of gold falling across the bed where she lay trembling, still recovering from the rupture. Her body ached in ways that went beyond physical pain. Every nerve screamed, every bruise reminded her of vulnerability, and every shallow breath felt like a betrayal of trust. She wanted to move, to reach for the phone on the nightstand, to call someone, anyone, but her strength was gone. He sat in the armchair beside the bed, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her with an unnerving calm. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as though he had spent the night in the company of someone entirely different, someone else's fear, someone else's suffering. "I couldn't," she began, her voice shaking. Words failed her. He didn't respond at first. He just sipped his coffee, eyes following her every twitch, every shallow inhale. That calm was suffocating. It wasn't concern, it was calculation. "You're fine," he finally said, voice low, almost convincing. "The doctor said this could happen. Minor complications. Nothing serious." Her body protested. Nothing serious? The way her abdomen burned, the ache of her back, the lingering dizziness. It screamed otherwise. She struggled to sit up, a wave of nausea making her freeze halfway. "Stop," he said sharply. "Just lie down. Moving too much will make it worse." But she knew the truth before the words could be fully processed. He had done nothing while she suffered. Every second of inaction had been a choice, a decision he had made, and it had endangered her life. The memory of the previous night hit her in full force. The pain, the screaming, the helplessness, the way his hands hovered, not touching, not helping. She had pleaded, she had begged, and he had stayed silent. "Why?" she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "Why didn't you call anyone?" He looked at her, calm again, almost unnervingly so. "It wasn't necessary," he said. "I knew it would pass. Doctors overreact." Her chest tightened. Pass? She had almost died, and he was calling it passing. She tried to protest, tried to make him see the truth of her fear, the reality of her bleeding body. But his eyes didn't waver. There was no guilt, only control, only the quiet assertion that this was not an accident. It was a lesson. Her mind flickered, searching for justification, trying to reason, to understand why someone would watch and wait instead of helping. Fear mixed with confusion, shame creeping in. Was it my fault? The question twisted in her mind, though she knew deep down it wasn't. Hours passed in silence. He brought her water, adjusted her pillows, spoke occasionally in clipped, rehearsed sentences, maintaining the illusion of care. But the weight of what he hadn't done pressed down heavier than any tenderness he offered. When the phone rang, her mother checking in, unaware of the night's events. He picked it up first, answering calmly, hiding every trace of chaos. His smile, polite and controlled, masked the night's truth. She watched him, paralyzed, anger and fear coiling inside her like a living thing. By evening, the nurse finally arrived, summoned not by him but by the clinic's automatic follow-up protocols. They moved quickly, checking vitals, ordering scans, noting bruises and swelling. Her survival, she realized, was thanks to protocol, not him. As the nurse packed up, giving her instructions and warning signs, he stood behind her, offering words that fell hollow. "See? Nothing serious," he said, his hand brushing hers lightly. She looked up at him, tears slipping despite herself. The realization settled cold and undeniable. He had watched her suffer when a call for help could have saved hours of agony. She could forgive accidents. She could endure mistakes. But this was intentional, and it terrified her in ways she couldn't name. That night, lying in a hospital bed once he had left, she traced the contours of her body in the dim light, feeling every tender bruise, every ache, every reminder of vulnerability. She had survived, not because of him, but despite him. And somewhere in the quiet corners of her mind, a thought began to grow, fragile but determined. Survival alone would not be enough. One day, the truth would come, and when it did, she would see him for what he truly was. By the time the detective arrived at the hospital for the first follow-up, the first threads of suspicion had already been set. The story of that night, twisted and controlled, was only just beginning to unfold. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. The familiar scent of survival, laced with the tang of metal from the monitors. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as though it might give her answers. Her body had survived, barely, but her mind felt fractured, scattered across bruises, scars, and the memory of a night that should never have happened. Doctors and nurses moved around her efficiently, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, murmuring in medical shorthand she didn't fully understand. Each movement was precise, clinical, a stark contrast to the chaos of her emotions. One nurse offered a sympathetic glance, the kind that said, "I know, and I'm sorry you had to endure this." But the words were never spoken aloud, leaving her with silence as her only companion. He was there, of course, standing near the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, as if it just wandered into someone else's crisis and was expected to act normal. His presence was suffocating. She wanted to scream, to tell the doctors the truth, but something in her chest held the words back. Fear, shame, and a deep-seated habit of pleasing him clashed violently inside her. "Your vitals are stabilizing," a doctor said, finally breaking the tension. "We'll continue monitoring, but your recovery physically is going well." Physically, that word landed like a stone in her stomach. Yes, she had survived. Yes, her body was healing. But the truth, the emotional, psychological truth, was bleeding in ways no bandage or medication could touch. She glanced at him. His face remained unreadable, neutral, calm. To any outsider, he appeared to be the devoted husband, attentive, concerned. But she remembered the previous night, the way he had watched, the way he had done nothing. She wanted to tell someone. Someone needed to know. But the narrative he had carefully built blocked her every attempt. Friends, family, even medical staff, all had been carefully managed, fed fragments of information. He was charming, persuasive, and above all, convincing. And she, traumatized, weak, hesitant, felt incapable of arguing against the image he presented. During a quiet moment, she tried to speak to the nurse privately. I need to tell you what happened last night," she whispered. But even as the words formed, fear stole him away. What if no one believed her? What if she lost him? The conflicting emotions churned inside her, leaving her paralyzed. Her body was healing, but her voice, the one that mattered most, remained fractured. She realized with a bitter clarity that survival was not just about the body. Survival required secrecy, compromise, and endurance she hadn't signed up for. As the day progressed, the detective made his first rounds in the hospital. Haleem observed quietly from the corner, notebook in hand, noting her physical condition, her demeanor, the subtle tension in the room. He noticed inconsistencies, the polite calm of the husband, the hesitant glances, the way the woman flinched when he approached. He didn't speak immediately, letting her settle, letting the room breathe. Patterns, he knew, revealed themselves when no one was watching. The husband moved closer to her bed when the doctor stepped away, offering gentle words and a reassuring hand. To anyone watching, it was affection. To her, it was a reminder of everything she had endured, every choice he had made while she had suffered. By evening, the nurse left, leaving the two of them alone. She traced the bruises along her hips, fingertips brushing the tender skin. Every mark was a memory, every ache a silent accusation. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I survived, but the truth didn't survive." Her eyes drifted to the window, where the fading sun cast long shadows across the floor. Outside, life continued as usual, unaware of what had happened behind these walls. Inside, she realized that recovery would not be measured by physical healing alone. The truth, her story, the choices made, the inaction that nearly cost her life, was trapped, locked in silence, waiting for someone to uncover it. And Haleem, patient and observant, had already begun to untangle the first threads. The story was no longer just about survival. It was about uncovering the betrayal behind it, piece by painful piece. By the time night fell, she understood one thing with chilling clarity. Surviving the rupture was only the beginning. The truth, hidden by control and fear, would take far longer to emerge. Detective Haleem didn't need confessions. He had spent years learning to read silence, to notice the rhythm of words, the weight of pauses, the subtle gestures that betrayed the truth when people tried hardest to hide it. And in the hospital room, as he observed the woman lying quietly in her bed, he could see it. A life controlled, a story manipulated, a pattern that refused to be ignored. The husband moved through the room as if on a stage, offering smiles, polite nods, and calm words to anyone who looked. Doctors, nurses, even the occasional visitor were convinced of his devotion. But Armin saw the gaps, the brief flicker of irritation when she flinched, the way he repositioned her pillows even when she had asked him not to, the subtle tightening of his jaw when a nurse lingered too long. Patterns didn't lie. Later that afternoon, Armin requested a private conversation with the woman. Sitting beside her bed, he kept his voice low, calm. "You've been through a lot," he said, notebook open but untouched. "I just need you to tell me what you remember, in your own words." She hesitated, a flinch of fear passing across her features. The husband stood near the door, pretending to read a magazine, though his eyes were trained on every movement, every subtle gesture. I don't know where to start," she admitted, voice trembling. Memories of the night, pain, helplessness, the weight of his hands hovering, resurfaced, raw and unfiltered. "Start anywhere," Armin encouraged gently. "It's your story, nobody else's." She took a shaky breath. It's the little things. Every time he tells me what to wear, how to sit, how to move, he says it's for my own good. And I do it because I'm afraid he'll get angry, or because I've learned to trust his judgment even when it hurts." Armin nodded, scribbling notes silently. Each detail confirmed the pattern. Control disguised as care, manipulation hidden under affection. "That night," she continued, "when it ruptured, I called out. I begged for help. And he didn't." Her eyes filled with tears, the weight of betrayal undeniable. "I thought he loved me. I thought he wanted me safe. But he watched. He just watched." The silence in the room grew heavy, thick enough to press against the walls. Armin waited, letting her words settle. She wasn't asking for judgment. She needed recognition, someone to see the truth she had lived through. Later, he spoke privately to the nurse, gathering fragments from the night of the rupture. Delayed emergency response, signs of neglect, inconsistencies in the husband's recounting of events. Each piece was small, almost insignificant on its own, but patterns emerged like constellations forming a map. Armin left the hospital that evening, walking the streets in the dim glow of the setting sun. He thought of the husband, charming, calm, persuasive, and dangerous. The man had crafted a persona, built a narrative that concealed his indifference and control. But patterns Armin knew always repeated themselves. Small habits, subtle gestures, the ways people manipulate, isolate, and silence, those never changed. Across town, the husband prepared for another evening of performance. He smiled at his reflection in the hallway mirror, unaware that someone had already started mapping the cracks beneath the facade. Back in the hospital room, the woman pressed her hands to her abdomen, tracing the faint, healing bruises. She felt a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of clarity had begun to grow. She wasn't invisible. The truth existed, even if it was hidden beneath layers of control. And Armin Haleem was watching, waiting, knowing that once patterns were recognized, they couldn't be ignored. The next steps would require patience, evidence, and courage. But he was already a few moves ahead. The husband's carefully constructed world was starting to unravel. And when it did, there would be nowhere left to hide. The threads of betrayal, neglect, and manipulation were all there, quietly revealing themselves. And soon, the story of what happened during those 6 weeks, and the night that changed everything, would no longer be just whispers in the dark. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic, faint traces of flowers from a well-meaning visitor mingling with the clinical sterility. She sat up in bed, tracing the faint yellow bruises along her hips, the tender marks that still pulsed when touched. Her body was healing, but her mind, her thoughts, were trapped in a storm she couldn't name. Armin Haleem had left her that morning with a quiet instruction: tell the truth when you can. Someone will hear it, but she wasn't ready. Not yet, because she loved him. Or at least, she had thought she did. Even as she remembered the rupture, the excruciating pain, and the way he had watched rather than helped, her chest tightened with a familiar loyalty. His words, his calm demeanor, the careful smiles he offered when anyone else was around, they had been a kind of anchor. She wanted to believe he cared, that his inaction had been accidental, not intentional. The nurse arrived for a routine check, smiling gently. "You're healing well," she said, "but you need to keep monitoring for swelling or fever." "Yes," she murmured, voice small. The husband hovered nearby, hand lightly resting on the edge of the bed. "See? Doctors agree." "You're fine," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I told you it would pass." Her stomach nodded. "He's right," a part of her whispered. "It could have been worse." "It isn't that bad. I'm overreacting." It was a dangerous thought pattern, one Armin recognized instantly in victims he had seen before. Trauma bonding, the subtle, insidious way fear and love entwined, until survival itself became tied to defending the person who hurt you. Later, she tried to tell herself she had been careless. Maybe I moved wrong. Maybe I ignored his warnings. Each justification made her feel smaller, weaker, and somehow complicit. She looked at the marks on her body as though they were lessons, not injuries. When Armin returned in the evening, notebook in hand, she hesitated. She wanted to speak the truth, to recount the full story of inaction and pain, but the words lodged in her throat. She could see him in her mind, the calm husband, smiling, persuasive, protective in the eyes of the world. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Armin asked quietly. She shook her head. "It's complicated," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. He didn't mean to hurt me." Armin nodded without judgment. He had heard this before. Victims often defended abusers, not out of loyalty, but because admitting the truth could shatter their entire perception of safety and love. "I understand," he said. "You'll speak when you're ready. No rush." Later that night, she watched him as he prepared a glass of water, humming softly, every movement calm and deliberate. It should have made her angry, made her demand accountability. Instead, a flutter of affection still lingered in her chest. Her mind was a battlefield. One side screamed betrayal, fear, and rage. The other clung desperately to the small gestures of care he had offered, the words he had spoken, the illusion of protection he had carefully maintained. She felt trapped, not by physical restraints, but by psychological chains that she couldn't yet see clearly. She understood, faintly, that survival meant more than just living through the rupture. It meant surviving the mental grip of someone who could make her doubt her own instincts. It meant enduring not only the injury, but the emotional manipulation that had woven itself around her. As she lay back against the pillows, exhausted and unsure, a small thought took root, fragile but persistent. I survived the body, but the mind is still caught. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered, oblivious to the battles waging inside the hospital. And in the corner, waiting patiently, Armin Haleem knew that the first step toward uncovering the truth wasn't confrontation. It was giving her the time and space to see it herself. The next chapter of her story wouldn't be written with immediate revelations or confessions. It would unfold slowly, through careful observation, courage, and a recognition that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones the victims themselves must face before anyone else can help. And soon, when the defenses began to crack, the next pieces of the pattern would emerge, leading to the first undeniable signs that the husband's facade was far thinner than anyone had imagined. The hospital room felt different that morning. The sunlight slanting to the blinds illuminated more than just her bruises. It revealed fractures in a carefully constructed world around her. Detective Armin Haleem arrived quietly, notebook in hand, his presence unobtrusive but heavy. He had watched, observed, and noted patterns long enough to know that the husband's calm demeanor was fragile. He didn't announce himself. Instead, he watched from the doorway as the husband spoke to the nurse, offering polite, practiced reassurances. Everything he said, every gesture, was calculated. Armin had seen it before. The carefully timed smiles, the pauses, the subtle adjustments of words and tone, all designed to create an illusion of care. The first crack appeared in a small, almost imperceptible way. The nurse asked about the timeline of events the night of the rupture. The husband hesitated. A half-second pause that was long enough for someone trained to notice. Then, carefully, he offered response. I was there when it happened. I stayed calm, as any husband would. Armin took a mental note. Staying calm, an excuse often used to justify inaction. But the woman flinched at his words, the memory of pain and helplessness stirring inside her like a physical force. Later, in a more private moment, Armin asked her to recount exactly what happened that night. Her voice shook, but the words came. I screamed. I begged him to call for help, but he just watched. He didn't move. I almost didn't make it. The husband, standing near the doorway, tried to interject, his voice smooth and controlled. I told her to remain calm. I was trying to. Stop, Armin said quietly but firmly. His eyes didn't leave the husband. Let her speak. For the first time, the husband's control faltered. His jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. The carefully practiced calm cracked, if only for a fraction of a second. That fraction told Armin everything he needed to know. Deception, manipulation, and a deliberate choice to withhold help. She continued, recounting the hours she had spent in pain, the nausea, the fear, the helplessness. Each word landed like a hammer against the facade he had built so meticulously. His face, previously a mask of concern, now flickered with something darker. Frustration, irritation, fear. Armin watched, silent, letting the truth work its way to the surface. Lies, when repeated too often, have a way of unraveling. The husband had rehearsed the story countless times, but had never been tested against the actual experience of someone who had survived. Not just survived, but remembered every detail. By the afternoon, the first undeniable inconsistencies emerged. The husband's timeline didn't match the nurse's observations. His version of events contradicted her recollections. Each contradiction, small in isolation, formed a chain, and chains once formed cannot be ignored. Outside the room, the city went about its usual rhythm, unaware that a carefully maintained deception was unraveling inside a small hospital ward. Inside, tension thickened like fog, pressing against walls and hearts alike. Armin leaned forward slightly, notebook open. People lie to protect themselves, sometimes to protect others. But patterns don't lie. Actions, choices, those are harder to disguise. The husband's eyes narrowed, defensive, calculating. But even he could sense the change. His polished narrative was fraying, the threads pulling apart with each truthful word spoken by the woman who had survived. By evening, the cracks were undeniable. He tried to regain composure, but the detective's quiet scrutiny and her emerging courage had shifted the power balance. For the first time, his story was no longer entirely his own. And somewhere deep inside, the woman realized she was no longer entirely trapped. She could see the truth forming, piece by piece, in ways she hadn't dared before. The stage was set. The lies had begun to unravel, and the next confrontation, one that would force him to face the consequences of his choices, was inevitable. The interrogation room was stark, lit by a single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the walls. Detective Armin Haleem sat across from the husband, notebook closed for now. He didn't need to scribble. He had already memorized the patterns, the inconsistencies, the cracks in the carefully constructed facade. The man looked calm, too calm, hands folded neatly on the table, lips pressed into a practiced smile, eyes trained to meet the detective's without wavering. It was a confidence born of years of manipulation, of convincing the world that he was composed, that he was a devoted husband, that he was above suspicion. "You understand why you're here," Armin began, his voice steady, measured. "Yes," the husband said, almost too casually, "to discuss the unfortunate incident with my wife." Armin studied him quietly, letting the words hang. There was no urgency, no fear, no regret in that tone, just control. "Let's start with that night," Armin said. "Your wife suffered a serious injury. You were present. You didn't call for help immediately. Can you explain why?" The husband leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. "I wanted to give her time to rest. The doctor's instructions said not to overreact. I stayed calm, made sure she was comfortable." Armin didn't flinch. He had heard this excuse before. Calm in the face of danger is not courage. It is inaction. "Comfortable?" he repeated. "She nearly died. She called out to you. She begged for help. And you watched. You made a choice to wait." The husband's fingers drummed lightly on the table. I didn't realize the severity at first. I thought she was exaggerating. It happens." "Exaggerating." Armin's tone sharpened. "Her vitals, her bruising, her blood, all of that tells a different story. And you, the person who promised to protect her, chose to ignore it." For the first time, a shadow passed over the husband's carefully composed expression. A flicker of something darker, anger, fear, irritation. Escaped before he quickly masked it with polite detachment. "I was trying to prevent panic," he said, "to manage the situation. I didn't want to make things worse." Armin leaned forward slightly. "You didn't prevent anything. You delayed help. You watched her suffer. That is your truth, and now it's exposed." The man's hands tightened slightly. There was no tear, no visible remorse. Only a careful, clinical recounting of his reasoning. He confessed without shame, without emotional collapse, as if in his mind, logic justified inaction. "I didn't hurt her intentionally," he said, voice flat. "But, yes, I delayed. It was the only choice I saw at the time." Armin remained calm, letting the words settle. This was what he'd been waiting for. A confession not born of guilt, but of undeniable exposure. The truth had broken through the layers of manipulation, and the husband's own words were now evidence against him. "You see," Armin said quietly, "truth doesn't need tears to be powerful. Actions speak louder than any apology could, and your actions endangered someone you claimed to love." The husband nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the table. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden collapse, just a quiet recognition that the facade, the careful story, was gone. The world now knew what she had endured. Armin closed his notebook and stood. This is far from over. The legal process will decide the rest. But for now, the confession is on record. And you, for all your control, cannot undo the choices you made. As he left the room, the husband remained seated, still composed but hollowed by the undeniable truth. Outside, the hospital lights glimmered softly, casting shadows on the city streets. In another room, the woman lay recovering, bruises fading, but the weight of betrayal still heavy in her chest. She knew now that she had survived more than physical pain. She had survived the calculated inaction of someone she had once trusted completely. The stage was set for healing, for justice, and for the reckoning that would follow. And as the night deepened, both survivor and detective understood. The cost of truth is high, but it is always worth the price. The quiet after the confession was deafening. The hospital corridors, usually humming with life, seemed hollow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She lay in her bed, the bandages and bruises now fading into pale shadows, but her mind refused to rest. The truth had been spoken, the lie had cracked, and the confession had been delivered, but the cost of knowing it lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. She stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint, thinking of the weeks that had passed. 6 weeks of pain, of manipulation, of quiet terror that had masqueraded as care. Each memory pulsed through her, like a wound that refused to fully heal. And yet, the relief of exposure mingled with the grief of betrayal, creating a tension she couldn't resolve. Detective Armin Haleem stood silently by the door, observing. He had done his part. Uncovered the pattern, noted the inconsistencies, gathered the evidence, and drawn out the confession without a single raised voice. But even he knew that truth, once spoken, did not erase pain. It only reframed it, gave it context, and demanded a reckoning. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, stepping closer. She shook her head slightly. I survived. My body survived. But knowing the truth, it changes everything." Her voice trembled, though her eyes were firm. "I can't forget. I can't pretend it didn't happen. And somehow, I feel responsible for believing him, for trusting him." Armin nodded, understanding the weight she carried. "Survivors often carry that burden," he said. "Not because it's theirs to bear, but because the person who hurt them wanted them to feel it. It's part of manipulation, making you doubt yourself, even after the truth is undeniable." She closed her eyes, trying to exhale the tight knot of fear and betrayal. Her mind replayed the rupture, the night of pain, the silent hours when he chose inaction over protection. She remembered the hospital monitors, the nurse's careful glances, the detective's quiet observation. All of it, the near death, the betrayal, the uncovering, had a price she now had to pay. "The cost of truth," Armin continued, "is that you can't go back. You can't unsee what was done or unhear the lies. But the gift is that you see clearly now. You know who he is, and you can make choices moving forward based on reality, not illusion." She swallowed hard. It was a bitter pill, but she knew he was right. The comfort of ignorance, the fleeting relief of pretending everything was fine, was gone, replaced now by clarity, raw and painful, but real. Hours later, when the hospital emptied for the night, she sat by the window, watching the city glow beneath her. Traffic lights blinked, distant sirens wailed, and somewhere life moved forward for everyone else. For her, life had shifted irreversibly. The man who promised care had revealed himself as something else entirely. Someone who prioritized control over love, observation over protection. She touched the fading bruises on her hips, tracing each one gently. Physical recovery had been possible. The scars were healing. But emotional recovery, the kind that demanded trust, boundaries, and self-assertion, it would take longer, and it would require courage she hadn't needed until now. A small lesson crystallized in her mind, fragile but steady. Survival alone is not enough. Understanding, acknowledging, and acting on the truth is the real path to freedom. Pain, betrayal, and fear are part of the journey, but there are also signposts pointing towards strength she hadn't known she possessed. Detective Armin Haleem left quietly, giving her space. She didn't need him now. She had what mattered most, clarity, and the beginning of her own authority over her life. She could rebuild, reclaim, and redefine herself beyond the shadow of his control. Outside the hospital, night deepened into silence, and she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a tentative sense of power. Not over him, not over the past, but over herself. Every choice from this point forward would belong to her, informed by the truth she had survived and understood. The cost of knowing the truth had been high. Physical pain, emotional betrayal, the shattering of trust. But the gift it carried was higher. Freedom, awareness, and the knowledge that she could endure, not just survive. For the first time in 6 weeks, She exhaled fully. The journey ahead was uncertain, the road long, but she was no longer a prisoner of illusion. She had faced the unthinkable, confronted the silence, and emerged ready to claim her life back, one deliberate, self-determined step at a time. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between fear and recovery, she realized the truth doesn't just expose the darkness, it lights the way forward.